The medieval world stretches before us like a landscape seen through morning mist, familiar in outline, strange in detail, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. For roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome to the stirrings of what we call the Renaissance, Europe existed in a state that our modern minds struggle to comprehend. Not because medieval people were simple. They were not, but because the assumptions that govern their existence differ so profoundly from our own that crossing into their world requires us to leave behind almost everything we take for granted. There was no electricity, no running water, no medicine that reliably cured, no education for the vast majority, no concept of progress as we understand it. The belief that tomorrow might be better than today, that children might live easier lives than their parents. The medieval peasant existed within a world that seemed fixed, eternal, ordained by God, and maintained by tradition. The Lord ruled because lords had always ruled. The church demanded because the church had always demanded. The fields required labor because fields had always required labor. Change, when it came as catastrophe, plague, famine, war, not as improvement. And yet, within this world that seems so constrained, so harsh, so devoid of what we consider essential to human flourishing, people found meaning, found joy in festivals and family, in the rhythm of seasons and the rituals of faith, found dignity in labor well performed, in obligations fulfilled, in community that supported even as it constrained. The medieval peasant was not merely a victim of history, though victimhood was certainly part of their inheritance. They were human beings navigating existence with the tools available to them, making choices within limits we can barely imagine, loving and grieving and hoping in ways that would be recognizable to any of us if we could sit with them beside their smoky fires on long winter nights. Tonight we will sit with them. We will enter their fields and their hovels, their churches and their festivals. We will feel the weight of their labor and the lightness of their rare celebrations. We will understand as best we can across the centuries what it meant to be among the forgotten majority. The peasants who built medieval civilization with their hands and their backs, who fed the lords and funded the cathedrals, who lived and died in the shadows of history. This is not a story of progress, not a tale of heroes, not a chronicle of great events. This is an attempt to sit quietly with ordinary existence in an extraordinary time, to honor those who left no monuments except the fields they cultivated, no legacy except the children who continued their labor, no voice except the silence that has swallowed their names. Let the evening deepen, let the modern world recede, and let us walk together into a past that is gone but not entirely lost, that speaks still in the contours of ancient fields, in the stones of village churches, in the rhythms of agricultural life that persist even now in corners of our mechanized world. The medieval peasant awaits. Their story, so long unspoken, deserves at last to be told. In the gray light before dawn, when mist still clung to the furrows and the world seemed suspended between night and day, a man walked into a field that his father had walked before him, and his father's father before that, back through generations beyond memory. The field did not belong to him. It would never belong to him. He was born upon it, would labor upon it all his days, and would likely be buried in the churchyard that bordered its edge. But ownership was a concept that applied to lords, not to those who actually worked the soil. This was the fundamental reality of medieval peasant existence, the profound disconnect between labor and possession. The peasant knew every stone in his strips of land, knew where the soil ran thin and where it held moisture, knew which corner caught the morning sun and which stayed cold into April. He knew this land more intimately than the lord who owned it would ever know anything. Yet the land was not his. The crops he grew would be divided, a portion to the Lord, a portion to the church, and what remained, if anything remained, to feed his family through the year. The field system itself was a thing of strange beauty and stranger logic. A peasant's land was not consolidated in one place, but scattered across the village's fields in narrow strips, some as little as a furrow's width, distributed so that good land and poor land, wet land and dry land, were shared among all the villagers. The system ensured a kind of equality in poverty. No family could monopolize the best soil, but it also ensured inefficiency that would have horrified any modern farmer. To work your scattered strips, you walked miles back and forth across the fields. Your crops were planted alongside your neighbors, making individual innovation nearly impossible. The rhythm of planting and harvest had to be communal, coordinated, everyone moving together through the agricultural year. The plow that broke this earth was a thing of weight and difficulty. The heavy moldboard plow, capable of turning the dense clay soils of northern Europe, required a team of 8 oxen to pull, more animals than any single peasant family could own. So the village pooled its animals, pooled its labor, pooled its fate. When your oxen were sick, your neighbor's oxen pulled your plow. When your neighbor's harvest failed, your harvest helped feed their children. The interdependence was absolute, was inescapable, was both the salvation and the constraint of medieval village life. The plowing began in autumn, after the harvest was gathered, when the fields lay open and exhausted. The peasant walked behind his plow, guiding the blade into earth that resisted and then yielded, turning up soil that smelled of time and decomposition. The furrows stretched behind him in lines that were never quite straight, the medieval ridge and furrow pattern that still marks ancient fields, visible from the air like the fingerprints of forgotten centuries. Each pass of the plow was a small act of faith, faith that the rains would come in proper measure, that the sun would shine when sunshine was needed, that the Lord would not take too much, that the family would survive another year. The sowing followed in spring, when the earth had softened and warmed enough to receive the seed. The peasant walked his strips with a bag of grain slung across his body, casting seed with a motion that was half art and half prayer. Each handful of grain represented potential, potential bread, potential survival, potential life for children who depended on his skill and his luck in equal measure. The birds followed, eating what they could, taking their portion as the Lord would take his, as the church would take its tithe. The peasant could not fence his strips, could not protect his seed except by the scarecrows he fashioned from old clothes and crossed sticks, figures that stood in the fields like mute guardians, like representations of the peasant himself, standing against forces far too large to defeat. The summer was watching the green shoots emerge, watching for the pests and diseases that could destroy a crop overnight, watching the sky for the clouds that might bring needed rain or devastating hail. The peasant had no control over these forces, could not irrigate in drought, could not protect against flood, could not do anything but watch and wait and pray. The saints were invoked by name: Saint Swithin for rain, Saint Medard for good weather, the Virgin Mary for everything, always. The medieval peasant lived in a world dense with spiritual powers, and every one of them might be petitioned for help that could not come from any earthly source. The harvest was exhaustion and anxiety compressed into a few desperate weeks. Every hand was needed, men and women, elderly and children, all of them bent over the grain with sickles, cutting and gathering and binding into sheaves before the weather could turn. The race was against time, against rot, against the storms that could flatten a standing crop and destroy a year's hope in an afternoon. The peasant worked from first light until he could no longer see his blade, worked until his back seized and his hands bled, worked because there was no alternative, because the harvest determined whether his family ate through winter or starved. And when the last sheaf was gathered, when the tithe was paid, and the Lord's portion surrendered, the peasant could count what remained and calculate the year ahead. Some years there was enough. Some years there was even abundance, and the peasant could set aside a small surplus against the inevitable bad year to come. But many years there was not enough. Many years the calculation came up short, and the peasant faced winter, knowing that before spring returned, his family would be hungry, would be choosing between seed grain and survival, would be learning again what it meant to live at the mercy of forces utterly beyond human control. The field held these prayers, the hopes of generations pressed into its soil. The labor of countless forgotten hands turned into the land itself. And when the peasant finally returned to his hut in the darkness after harvest, when he collapsed onto his straw pallet and felt his muscles burning with the day's work, he might have looked up at the smoke-blackened thatch above him and wondered, as his father had wondered, and his children would wonder, whether this was all there was, whether the turning of seasons and the turning of soil was the sum of human existence, whether God looked down on the field and saw the prayers that were planted there, or whether the prayers rose into a silence that heard nothing and answered nothing and cared nothing for the man who prayed. The field remained, the prayers remained, the labor continued, and the medieval peasant rose the next morning, and the morning after, and all the mornings of his brief life, to walk again into the furrows that held 1,000 prayers, prayers for bread, prayers for mercy, prayers for meaning in a world that offered so little of any of them. The manor house stood above the village like a reproach, stone where the peasants had wattle, glass where they had shutters, warmth where they had cold. It was not usually a castle, not the great fortress of legend, but it was grand enough to any peasant who looked upon it. 2 stories, perhaps, a great hall where fires burned and meat roasted, chambers where the lord and his family slept in beds with covers, on mattresses filled with wool or feathers. A world apart from the hovels that clustered in its shadow, a world the peasant entered only as servant, never as guest. The lord was, in theory, a protector. The feudal compact that bound medieval society was supposed to be reciprocal. The peasant gave labor and loyalty. The lord gave protection and justice. In times of war, the lord's walls offered shelter. His armed men offered defense. His grain stores offered survival when invaders burned the fields. The theory was noble enough. The practice was considerably more complicated. The serf, and many medieval peasants were serfs, bound to the land they worked, existed in a condition somewhere between freedom and slavery. They were not property exactly, not chattels to be bought and sold at will. But they were not free either. They could not leave the manor without the Lord's permission. They could not marry without the Lord's permission. They could not send their sons to be educated, could not pursue trades, could not do anything that might lift them from the condition into which they had been born without permission from the man who owned the land to which they were bound. The burdens were specific and inescapable. The villain, the unfree peasant, owed labor to the Lord's domain, the portion of the manor's land that the Lord kept for his own use. This work was required before the peasant could tend his own strips, which meant that during the crucial weeks of planting and harvest, the peasant's own crops might suffer while he worked the Lord's fields. The obligation was called week work, and it might amount to 2 or 3 days of every week spent in labor that benefited only the Lord. There was also boon work, additional labor demanded at harvest time, when every hand was needed and the Lord's needs took precedence over the peasant's own. Beyond labor there were fees. A fee to use the Lord's mill, where you were required to grind your grain, and required to pay for the privilege, usually a portion of the flour that remained after grinding. A fee to use the Lord's oven, where you were sometimes required to bake your bread. A fee when you married, called merche. A fee when your father died and you inherited his tenancy, called harriet, often the best beast the family owned, handed over to the Lord at the moment of greatest grief, a tax on death itself. A fee if your daughter was caught in fornication, payable to the Lord who held rights even over your family's moral failings. The manor court was where these obligations were enforced, and where the peasant's few rights found such protection as existed. The lord or his steward presided, but the court operated according to custom, and custom in the medieval world had a weight that even lords sometimes had to respect. The customs of the manor were recorded in documents that peasants could not read, but that constrained even the powerful to some degree. When a lord tried to impose new obligations, peasants could appeal to custom, could argue that their grandfathers had not owed this labor, this fee, this portion. Sometimes they won. More often they did not. But the custom at least provided a language of resistance, a framework within which the weak could speak to the powerful and occasionally be heard. The relationship between lord and peasant was not always brutal. Some lords took their protective obligations seriously, reduced rents in bad years, provided grain when harvests failed, treated their villains with something approaching paternalism. The medieval world was hierarchical, but not necessarily heartless. The bonds that tied peasant to lord were personal as well as legal, and personal relationships could soften legal harshness. The good lord was celebrated in folklore, remembered for generations, held up as model of how the system could work when those with power chose to wield it generously. But the system itself was designed for extraction. The lord lived well because the peasant lived poorly. The manor house was warm because peasant labor cut the wood, and peasant carts hauled it. The lord's table was full because the peasant's was empty, because the tithe and the rent and the fees accumulated into wealth that flowed always upward, never down. The peasant who walked past the manor house on his way to the fields knew, in whatever terms he had for the knowledge, that his labor created the Lord's leisure, that his hunger funded the Lord's feasting, that the relationship was not truly reciprocal, whatever the theory might claim. And there was violence. The Lord held power of justice, could imprison and fine and punish. The stocks stood in the village center, a reminder of what awaited those who violated the Lord's peace. For serious crimes, the punishment could be worse: hanging for theft, maiming for various offenses. The brutal physicality of medieval justice applied without much distinction between Lord's law and Lord's whim. The peasant who challenged his lord, who refused labor, who fled the manor, who complained too loudly, risked everything. The wise peasant endured, kept his head down, did what was required, and passed his bondage to his children, who would pass it to theirs. The shadow fell longest in the evening, when the sun dropped behind the manor house and the village dimmed to darkness. The peasant walking home from the fields passed from light into that shadow, felt its weight even if he could not articulate what it meant. The Lord might be miles away, attending court, or managing other properties, but his presence was never absent from the manor that bore his name. His officers collected his rents. His bailiff supervised his domain. His justice waited in the court for anyone who stepped outside the boundaries that custom and power had drawn. The dust of the peasant's labor settled everywhere, in his clothes, in his hair, in the lines of his face that deepened each year until he looked old at 40, ancient at 50, if he lived that long. The dust was the residue of his existence, the physical trace of a life spent in service to land he would never own and a lord he could not choose. When he died, his children would pay Harriet and continue. When they died, their children would do the same. The dust accumulated across generations, and the shadow never lifted. Yet within the shadow, life persisted. The peasant loved his wife, cherished his children, laughed with his neighbors, found meaning in the rituals of church and season. The shadow defined his world, but did not entirely darken it. He was unfree, but he was not nothing. He had his community, his customs, his small dignities that even the Lord could not entirely take away. And when he stood at the boundary stone of the manor, looking out at the road that led to places he would never see, perhaps he imagined another life, or perhaps he simply turned back to the life he had, the only life he would ever know, and found in it what goodness he could. The Lord's shadow, the peasant's dust, forever intertwined, forever unequal, forever the foundation upon which medieval civilization rested, uneasily, unjustly, but with a strange stability that would endure for centuries before beginning, slowly, to crumble. Hunger was the constant companion, the uninvited guest who never quite left. The medieval peasant lived always within sight of starvation, always calculating the distance between the grain in storage and the mouths that needed feeding. This was not the dramatic famine of Chronicle, though that came too, terribly, periodically, but the chronic insufficiency that defined daily existence, the belly that was never quite full, the children who were always a little too thin, the old who quietly ate less so the young could eat more, a sacrifice made in kitchens that kept no records and left no testimony. The diet was monotonous in a way modern abundance cannot imagine. Bread was the staple, not the white bread of the Lord's table, but dark bread made from rye or barley, or whatever grain had been harvested, often mixed with chaff or acorn flour to stretch the supply. Pottage accompanied the bread, a thick soup of whatever vegetables could be grown or gathered, simmered for hours in the same pot that had simmered yesterday's meal and would simmer tomorrow's. Beans and peas provided protein. Onions and leeks added flavor. The pot was never empty, but it was never quite satisfying either, a tepid fullness that left the body working but never thriving. Meat was rare. The peasant might keep a pig, feeding it scraps and acorns, slaughtering it before winter to provide salt pork that would flavor the pottage for months. Chickens provided occasional eggs. A cow, if the family was fortunate enough to own one, gave milk that could be made into cheese. But the cow was too valuable to slaughter, was wealth on four legs, was kept alive as long as possible. Hunting was prohibited. The game in the forests belonged to the Lord, and poaching could cost a peasant his hand or his life. The rabbit that crossed the peasant's path, the deer glimpsed in the woodland, the birds that sang in the branches, all of these were forbidden, were the Lord's property, were temptations that wisdom counseled against pursuing. The church added its own restrictions to the belly's burden. Fast days required abstention from meat, eggs, and dairy, and fast days were frequent, adding up to nearly a third of the year. Lent stretched 40 days before Easter, a time of intensified hunger, when even the thin comfort of the egg was forbidden. Fridays were fast days. Wednesdays often were. The eves of major feasts demanded abstention. The peasant who was already hungry was commanded to be hungrier still, to offer his suffering to God, to find spiritual merit in physical deprivation. The calculations of survival were precise and unforgiving. A family needed a certain amount of grain to survive the year. Historians estimate perhaps 60 bushels for a family of 4. The harvest had to produce this amount plus the tithe for the church, plus the rent for the Lord, plus the seed grain for next year's planting. In good years, the calculation worked. In bad years, it did not, and bad years came with terrible regularity. The hungry gap was the time between when last year's stores ran out and this year's harvest came in. It fell in late spring and early summer, when the new crops were growing but not yet ready, when the bins were empty and the fields held only promise. During the hungry gap, peasants ate whatever they could find, foraged for wild plants, made bread from bark if necessary, calculated whether to eat the seed grain and doom next year's harvest to save this year's children. The choices were impossible, were made anyway, were made by millions of families across medieval Europe, year after year. The great famines wrote themselves into chronicle because they killed on a scale that could not be ignored. The famine of 1315 to 1317 was the worst in medieval memory, perhaps the worst in European history. The rains began in spring of 1315 and did not stop. The fields flooded. The crops rotted where they stood. Animals drowned. Salt could not be produced for preservation. The harvest failed completely across much of northern Europe, and then failed again in 1316, and only partially recovered in 1317. The accounts from those years strain belief. Prices rose tenfold, 20-fold, beyond what even the prosperous could pay. People ate their draft animals, eating tomorrow's labor to survive today. They ate dogs and cats and rats. The chronicles report, and we cannot know if this is truth or moral horror, that some ate the bodies of the dead, that some ate their own children. What is certain is that millions died. Perhaps 10% of Northern Europe's population perished in 3 years. The mass graves that have been excavated show bodies stacked without ceremony, without the individual burials that Christianity demanded, because there were too many dead and too few living to bury them properly. But even in ordinary years, hunger took its toll. Malnutrition weakened bodies, made them vulnerable to diseases that well-fed populations could resist. Children who survived infancy were often stunted, their growth limited by what their bodies had been given to work with. The medieval peasant was shorter than both their Roman ancestors and their modern descendants, not because of genetics but because of diet, because generations of insufficiency had written themselves into the very bones of the population. The hunger also wrote itself into the mind, into the dreams and stories and longings of medieval culture. The fantasy of the land of Cockine, a paradise where food grew without labor, where roasted pigs ran about waiting to be eaten, where streams flowed with wine and houses were built of sugar, reveals what medieval people most desperately wanted: to be full, to be satisfied, to know that tomorrow would bring enough. The fantasy was inversion of reality, was the dream of those who woke each morning to the same thin pottage, the same dark bread, the same calculation of whether the grain would last. The church bell calling peasants to Mass called them also to hunger. The ritual fast before communion, the reminder that earthly suffering was preparation for heavenly reward. The peasant knelt in the cold church, stomach empty, and heard promises of abundance in the life to come. The theology may have been comfort. It may have been control. Perhaps it was both. What is certain is that the belly's long silence shaped medieval faith as much as medieval faith shaped the belly's endurance. To be hungry and to believe that hunger had meaning, this was perhaps the central spiritual achievement of medieval peasant existence. Whether it was wisdom or delusion, we cannot say. Perhaps it was simply survival, the mind finding what it needed to continue when the body was not given enough. The silence of the belly, the sound that was absence of sound, the emptiness that was presence of want. Forever the companion of the medieval peasant. Forever the shadow within the shadow. Forever the truth that underlay all other truths about life at the bottom of the feudal order. The door was low. A grown man had to stoop to enter, and beyond it lay a darkness that the eyes needed time to penetrate. The medieval peasant home was not built for light, was built for shelter, for survival, for the bare minimum of protection from a world that offered little protection to those who worked it. The walls were wattle and daub, branches woven together and packed with mud mixed with straw and animal dung. The roof was thatch, bundles of straw or reeds that shed rain when well maintained and admitted it when neglected. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes that collected dirt and vermin, and were replaced when the smell became unbearable. One room for everything. The family slept here, perhaps on raised platforms against the walls, more often on straw pallets spread on the floor. The fire burned here, in a central hearth if there was no chimney, and there usually was no chimney, the smoke rising to the roof peak and escaping, eventually, through gaps in the thatch. The cooking happened here, in the same iron pot that had served the family for generations, hung over the same fire that provided the only heat. The animals lived here too, when winter came. The cow or the ox brought inside where its body heat would warm the human inhabitants, where its presence meant safety from the cold that could kill an animal left outside. The darkness was profound. Glass windows were unknown in peasant homes. Shutters could be opened to admit light and air, but they also admitted cold and rain, so they remained closed more often than not. Candles were luxury, tallow was valuable, and burning it for light was an expense most families could not afford except for necessity. The peasant rose with the sun and slept when it set, not by choice, but by the simple economics of illumination. The long winter evenings were spent in darkness. The family gathered around the fire's glow, talking perhaps, or simply sitting in the silence that darkness seemed to demand. The possessions were few, a chest perhaps for storing grain, or the family's single change of clothing. A table, rough-hewn, where meals could be taken when meals were substantial enough to require sitting. Stools rather than chairs. Chairs were for the wealthy. Wooden bowls and spoons, worn smooth by use, rarely replaced because the skill to make them or the money to buy them was scarce. An iron pot, a knife, perhaps a few tools for working the fields. The inventory of a peasant household could be completed in a breath. The poverty was not relative, but absolute, a life pared down to what was essential for survival and nothing more. Yet within this poverty, there were attempts at beauty. A carved spoon, perhaps, decorated with simple patterns by a father's hand during a winter evening. A chest with painted designs. A piece of embroidery worked by a mother who found in thread and needle some expression of the self that labor otherwise consumed. These small beautifications have mostly not survived. Wood rots, fabric decays, and the peasant's possessions were not worth preserving even when they could be. But the impulse toward beauty exists in all humans, and the medieval peasant was human, found ways to make the bare space of the hut into something that was, however modestly, home. The intimacy was absolute. There was no privacy as we understand it, no room of one's own, no space where a person could be alone with thoughts or sorrows or joys. The married couple slept beside their children, perhaps beside the grandparent who had no other place. The sounds of the night, breathing, coughing, the stirring of the animals, the noises of marital relations that could not be hidden, were the shared knowledge of everyone under the roof. Children grew up understanding the facts of life not from education, but from proximity, from the simple inability of adults to conceal what smaller houses could not contain. Birth happened here in this same room, attended by midwife and neighbor women, the father perhaps banished to the darkness outside while his wife labored in the firelight. Death happened here too, the elderly parent drawing final breaths in the same space where children played. The body washed and prepared by family members who knew no alternative, who could not afford the services that separated the wealthy from the physical realities of mortality. The hut contained all of life's passages, all compressed into a single space, all witnessed by everyone who belonged to the family. The smells were intense and inescapable. Human bodies unwashed because water was for drinking, and heating it required fuel. Animal bodies sharing the space, smoke from the fire that never fully cleared. The rushes on the floor accumulating waste of all kinds, food that might be spoiling because preservation was imperfect. Illness producing its own odors that could not be escaped because there was nowhere else to go. The modern nose would find a medieval peasant hut nearly unbearable. The medieval nose had adapted, had learned to filter what could not be avoided, had normalized what we would find impossible. And yet the hut was home, was the place where the peasant returned after exhausting labor, where the fire provided warmth that fields did not, where the faces of children offered something that made the labor worthwhile, was the place where stories were told in the darkness, where traditions were passed from generation to generation, where the culture of the village was created and maintained in the intimacy of shared space. The hut was small, was dark, was cramped and smelly, and devoid of comfort by any modern measure. But it was also the vessel that held the peasant's life, that contained what meaning could be found, that sheltered the dreams, however small, that made continuation possible. The dreams themselves were modest: to survive the winter, to see the children grow, to be buried in consecrated ground when the time came. The peasant in the hut did not dream of wealth or power or escape. Such dreams were dangerous, were invitations to disappointment, were luxuries that only those with surplus could afford. The dreams were calibrated to what was possible, were shaped by the walls that contained them, were small because the space that held them was small. Night falls on the village. The fires glow behind the shuttered windows. The families gather in their huts, drawing close for warmth that the fire alone cannot provide. Outside, the darkness is absolute. No streetlights, no illuminated windows, nothing but stars, and perhaps the moon to show the paths between the houses. Inside, the darkness is only slightly less, the fire's light reaching the corners, the faces of family members flickering in and out of visibility, the intimacy of shared space closing around them like a blanket that is not quite warm enough, but is all they have. The hut, the home, the small space that held small dreams. Forever the peasant's refuge. Forever the peasant's prison. Forever the place where medieval life was lived at its most essential, its most reduced, its most human. The bell rang out across the fields, calling the peasants from labor to prayer, from the horizontal work of cultivation to the vertical aspiration of worship. The church stood at the village center, often the only stone building for miles, its tower rising above the thatched roofs like a finger pointing toward a heaven that demanded much and promised more. The peasant who heard that bell heard the voice of God, or at least the voice of those who claimed to speak for him. The bell summoned to Mass on Sunday, to prayers on holy days, to funerals and baptisms and weddings that marked the passages of peasant life. It was the heartbeat of the village, the rhythm that organized time itself. The church building was the grandest space most peasants would ever enter. Stone walls that stayed cool in summer and cold in winter. Painted murals depicting saints and biblical scenes. The Bible of the illiterate, images that taught doctrine to those who could not read the words. Stained glass, perhaps, in wealthier parishes, transforming sunlight into colors that seemed to come from another world. The altar, dressed in cloth more fine than anything in a peasant's home. The crucified Christ hanging above it, suffering eternally so that suffering humanity might have hope. The priest was mediator between earth and heaven, the only person in most villages who could read, who had been trained in mysteries that ordinary people could not access. He celebrated the Mass in Latin, a language the peasants did not understand, transforming, according to doctrine, bread and wine into the actual body and blood of Christ. The miracle happened daily, was available to all who came to witness it, was the center around which village spiritual life revolved. Whether the peasant fully understood the theology is doubtful. What the peasant understood was that the priest had power, that the rituals mattered, that the church offered something the secular world could not, connection to the eternal, meaning that transcended the endless labor of earthly existence. The sacraments marked peasant life from beginning to end. Baptism brought the infant into the Christian community, washed away original sin, ensured that if death came early, as it so often did, the child's soul would not be consigned to limbo, that halfway place where unbaptized innocents were thought to dwell forever. Confirmation strengthened the young person's faith. Marriage blessed the union that would produce the next generation. Confession allowed the sinner to admit his failings and receive absolution. Extreme unction prepared the dying for the journey ahead. And burial in consecrated ground. This was essential, was the final gift the Church could offer, the assurance that the body would rest in sacred soil until the resurrection. But the Church demanded payment for its blessings. The tithe was the most burdensome. 1/10 of everything the peasant produced, owed to the Church before any other obligation. 1/10 of the grain, 1/10 of the vegetables, 1/10 of the animals born to the flock. The tithe was collected by the priest or by tithe agents who went from farm to farm, assessing what was owed. In theory, the tithe supported the parish, paid the priest's salary, maintained the church building, funded whatever charity the church offered. In practice, much of the tithe flowed upward, to bishops and monasteries, and ultimately to Rome, enriching an institution that was already the wealthiest in medieval Europe. Beyond the tithe, there were fees, mortuaries, payments made upon death, often the second-best animal the family owned, because the Lord took the best as Harriet, and the Church took what remained. Fees for marriage, for baptism, for prayers said for souls in purgatory. The Church's economy was vast and intrusive, reaching into peasant life at every significant moment, extracting payment for services that the peasant could not refuse, that doctrine had were essential for salvation. Purgatory loomed over medieval spirituality like a second death. The doctrine held that almost no one went directly to heaven. Instead, souls spent time in purifying fire, burning away the sins that remained even after confession and absolution. The time in purgatory could be shortened through prayers, through masses said for the deceased, through indulgences purchased from the church. The wealthy could afford many masses, could endow chantry chapels where priests prayed perpetually for their souls. The poor could afford little, faced the prospect of centuries in the flames, while the wealthy rose more quickly to bliss. Even in the afterlife, inequality persisted. Yet the Church also offered comfort, offered explanation for suffering, that it was consequence of sin, original and personal, that it had purpose in the divine plan. Offered community. The village gathered in church was village united, was people who knew each other worshiping together, affirming shared belief and shared identity. Offered beauty, the music of the liturgy, the pageantry of festivals, the art that decorated even modest parish churches. Offered hope, that this life was not all there was, that the suffering would end, that somewhere beyond death waited reward for those who had endured faithfully. The saints were intermediaries, were specialized helpers for specialized needs. Saint Swithin for rain, Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Margaret for childbirth. The peasant lived in a universe populated by spiritual beings who could be petitioned for aid, who listened, perhaps, to prayers the distant God might not hear. The relics of saints, bones, clothes, fragments associated with holy lives, were treasured by churches, attracted pilgrims, worked miracles that testified to the saints' continued presence and power. Whether the peasants' faith was sophisticated theology or something closer to magical thinking, whether the prayers to saints were worship or negotiation, the relationship was real, was meaningful, was the spiritual texture of medieval existence. The church year structured the calendar. Christmas and Easter were the great feasts, but dozens of smaller feasts honored saints, marked events in Christ's life, provided rhythm to the year. Fast days required abstention. Feast days allowed celebration. The church determined when one could marry, when one must abstain from marital relations, when one could eat meat and when one could not. The church's calendar was the peasant's calendar, its rhythms, the rhythms of village life, its commands, the commands that shaped daily existence. The bell rang out across the fields, calling to prayer, calling to obligation, calling to hope. The peasant who walked to church walked into a space that was both refuge and burden, both comfort and demand. The stone walls enclosed a mystery that offered meaning but extracted payment. The priest spoke words the peasant could not understand, but believed were powerful, were necessary, were the difference between salvation and damnation. The church bell's heavy blessing fell on all who heard it, promising much, demanding much, asking the peasant to believe that the suffering of this life would be redeemed in the life to come. Whether the promise was kept, only the dead could know. The living could only believe, or try to believe, and offer their coins, and their candles, and their prayers, into the silence where God might be listening, where the saints might be interceding, where the flames of purgatory might be shortened by one more Mass purchased, one more indulgence obtained. The church bell's blessing, heavy, inescapable, the sound that shaped medieval life, forever ringing, forever calling, forever promising, and forever demanding. Beyond the cultivated fields, where the careful strips and furrows gave way to rougher ground, lay the commons, land that belonged to everyone, and therefore, in a sense, to no one. This was the pasture where villagers grazed their animals together, the woodland where they gathered fuel, the waste ground where they cut turf and collected wild foods. The commons represented a different logic than the manor system, an older pattern of shared use that persisted alongside private lordship, a remnant of collective existence that even feudalism could not entirely erase. The village pasture was where the peasants' few animals, a cow perhaps, a handful of geese, some sheep, joined with the neighbor's animals to graze the common grass. The animals were the peasant's wealth, such wealth as the peasant had. The cow provided milk that could become cheese, provided the calf that might be sold or kept, provided the labor that helped work the fields. To lose the cow was catastrophe, was poverty deepening into destitution. The commons allowed even the poorest villager to keep animals, to have access to grazing that individual holdings could not provide, to participate in a form of wealth that might otherwise be impossible. The woodland was equally essential. Fuel for the fire came from the commons, the right to gather fallen branches, to cut underwood, to haul deadfall home for burning. Without this right, the peasant would have frozen, would have had no way to cook the pottage that sustained life, would have been utterly dependent on the lord who controlled the forest. The commons gave the peasant independence, however modest, a source of fuel that did not require payment, did not require permission beyond the customs that the village itself enforced. The customs governing the commons were elaborate and ancient. Rights to graze, to gather, to hunt the small game that was not reserved for the Lord. These rights were recorded in memory, if not in writing, passed down through generations, enforced by the village community in the manorial court. The customs determined how many animals each household could graze, which trees could be cut, and which protected, when the commons would be open, and when closed. The customs created a system of rules without formal law, of governance without government, of order maintained through collective agreement and collective enforcement. The manorial court was where this governance happened. Presided over by the lord or his steward, the court was nonetheless largely populated by the peasants themselves, by jurors drawn from the village who testified to custom and judged violations. The court settled disputes between neighbors, the straying pig, the moved boundary marker, the accusation of theft or assault. The court imposed fines for violations of the customs, the fines going to the Lord, but the judgment coming from the community. The court was medieval peasant democracy, limited but real, a space where even the unfree had voice, where custom was preserved and enforced by those who lived under it. The commons represented something that would later be lost, a conception of property that was not individual but collective, a recognition that some resources belonged to the community rather than to any single person. The rich could not monopolize the commons. The poor were not entirely excluded. The system was not equal. Larger landholders had more grazing rights than smaller ones, but it was equalizing, ensured that everyone had some access, that no one fell entirely outside the web of communal support. But the commons were already under threat. The enclosure movement, which would eventually transform English agriculture, was beginning in the medieval period. Lords fencing off common lands for their private use, converting shared pasture to sheep runs as wool prices rose. Each enclosure reduced what the poor could access, concentrated land in fewer hands, moved the agricultural system away from the communal patterns that had characterized it for centuries. The process was slow in the medieval period, would accelerate in later centuries, would eventually destroy the commons entirely, but the pressures were visible, the conflicts present, the future already casting its shadow over the shared lands. The village herdsman gathered the animals each morning, led them to the common pasture, watched over them through the day. The job was often given to the young or the elderly, to those not needed for heavier labor. The herdsman knew each animal, knew which belonged to which family, could separate them at evening without confusion. The evening return, the animals flowing back toward the village, separating without guidance to their proper homes, was a small miracle of community memory, of animals trained by habit to return to where they belonged. The geese waddling home, the cattle lowing, the sheep bleating as they found their pens, the sounds of evening on the commons, the sounds of shared resources returning to individual keeping, the daily enactment of the commons' strange logic, collectively held, individually used, belonging to all and to no one. The commons were not paradise, were contested, were inadequate, were unequally shared despite the equalizing customs, were the site of petty disputes and jealousy, of accusations that one neighbor was taking more than their share, of conflicts that the manorial court could not always resolve, were threatened by lords who wanted to convert shared land to private profit, were already diminishing, already under pressure that would eventually prevail. But the commons represented something real, a recognition that survival required cooperation, that individual households could not meet their needs without shared resources, that the village was more than collection of separate families, was community bound together by common land and common customs. The commons were the physical expression of medieval solidarity, the ground upon which peasant society was built, the shared inheritance that made individual poverty more bearable. Evening falls on the common pasture. The last animals are led home. The grass is cropped short by the day's grazing, but will grow again by morning. The commons wait in darkness for tomorrow's use, for the cycle to continue, for the village to exercise again the rights that custom had preserved, and that future centuries would slowly, inexorably take over the commons, where all were equal in poverty, where the poorest had something, where the village was more than its individual parts, forever diminishing, forever mourned when gone, forever the memory of a different way of being, when some things were not for sale, when some ground belonged to everyone, when community meant more than proximity. The wheel of the year turned without reference to human hope, without pity for human need. The seasons came as they had always come, demanding labor appropriate to each turning, offering no negotiation with those who worked the land. The medieval peasant existed within this wheel, was bound to it more completely than any modern person can imagine. When the soil required plowing, you plowed. When the crops required harvesting, you harvested. When winter came, you endured or you died. The seasons showed no mercy, and neither could those who lived by them show mercy to themselves. Michaelmas came at the end of September, marking the turn from harvest to preparation. The rents were due, the accounting of the agricultural year, the moment when the Lord's portion was calculated and extracted. The autumn plowing began, turning the stubble under, preparing the fields for the winter wheat that would be sown in the shortened days to come. The animals were assessed, which could be kept through winter, which must be slaughtered because there was not fodder enough for all. The autumn slaughter was bloody necessity, was the death of creatures that had been tended all year, was the salting of meat that would sustain the family through the cold months when nothing grew. Winter was endurance. The fields could not be worked when frozen, could not produce anything when the sun showed its face for only a few hours each day. The peasant turned to other work, maintaining tools, repairing the hut, whatever could be done indoors while the wind howled outside, and the fire seemed never quite warm enough. The stores diminished week by week, the careful calculations always running. Is there enough? Will we last until spring? The hunger was constant companion. The cold was constant enemy. The darkness seemed sometimes to stretch without end. Candlemas in February brought the first hope, the days noticeably lengthening, the angle of the sun climbing towards spring. The candles blessed at church would protect the household through the year. The customs were observed, the prayers were offered, the waiting continued. But hope was dangerous. Winter could still kill, could still send storms that buried villages, could still bring the cold snap that destroyed what remained of the stored food. Spring plowing began when the ground thawed, when the soil could be worked again, when the oxen could be driven into fields that had rested through winter. The urgency was extreme. Every day mattered. Every delay reduced the growing season. Every mistake could not be corrected. The peasant worked from dawn until exhaustion, driving the plow through soil that resisted, preparing the furrows for the spring planting that would determine whether the family survived another year. Lent fell during this season, adding religious restriction to physical labor, the fast deepening the hunger just when the work demanded most. The sowing followed the plowing, the peasant walking his strips with the bag of seed, casting the grain with the motion that centuries had refined. The seed corn was precious, had been saved from last year's harvest, had been protected through winter, represented the future in each handful. The birds came to steal what they could. The rain might come too heavy or not heavy enough. The late frost might kill what had sprouted. Every field contained anxiety. Every strip bore hope that might be betrayed. Summer was watching and waiting. The crops grew or did not grow, responded to conditions the peasant could not control. The weeding was endless, the wild plants returning as fast as they could be pulled, competing with the crops for soil and sun. The hay harvest came in June or July, the grass cut and dried and stored for winter fodder, the work hard and the window brief, the weather determining success or failure. Midsummer brought the longest day, the pivot point from which the light would begin to diminish, the reminder that even at summer's height, winter was already approaching. Lammas at the beginning of August marked the first grain harvest, the first loaf baked from the first wheat offered at church in thanksgiving for what the land had provided. But the main harvest was still to come, the weeks of labor that would determine everything. The grain had to be cut with sickles, had to be gathered into sheaves, had to be stacked and dried before threshing could separate the kernels from the chaff. Every hand was needed, men, women, children, elderly, all bent to the work from first light until last, racing against the weather that could destroy everything. The threshing followed the cutting, the sheaves beaten with flails on the threshing floor, the rhythm of the work becoming a kind of music, the grain accumulating in piles that could be measured, could be divided, could become the numbers that determined whether the year had succeeded or failed. The tithe was taken, the rent was paid, the seed corn was set aside, and what remained, if anything remained, was the family sustenance for the year to come. And then Michaelmas came again, and the wheel turned again, and the seasons continued their pitiless procession. The peasant who survived to see another spring knew that survival was achievement, knew that the wheel would keep turning whether individual lives continued or not, knew that the labor would be the same and the anxiety would be the same, and the hunger would wait in the hungry gap as it had always waited. The seasons showed no mercy. The medieval peasant could show no weakness. The wheel turned, and the labor continued, and the years accumulated into a life that was measured not in accomplishments, but in survival, not in progress, but in persistence, not in change, but in the endless repetition of what had always been done because there was no alternative, because the seasons demanded obedience and accepted no refusal. The wheel of the year, turning without pity, demanding without exception, the rhythm that governed peasant life more completely than any lord, more absolutely than any priest. The seasons, forever showing no mercy, forever requiring everything the peasant had to give. The silence came first, the silence of a village where no one moved, where no smoke rose from the houses, where the church bell had stopped ringing because no one remained to ring it. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried on ships from the east, spreading along the trade routes that connected medieval civilization, finding in the cramped and hungry populations of Europe the perfect conditions for catastrophe. Within 5 years, between one-third and one-half of Europe's population was dead. The medieval world that existed before the plague was not the medieval world that existed after. Everything changed, even if much remained the same. The disease itself was horror beyond imagining. The bubonic form produced swellings in the lymph nodes, buboes they were called, that grew to the size of eggs or apples, that turned black with internal bleeding, that burst and oozed. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs, spread through coughs and breath, killed even faster than the bubonic. The septicemic form poisoned the blood directly, killed so quickly that victims sometimes died before symptoms appeared, died healthy in the morning and dead by evening. Contemporary accounts speak of streets filled with bodies, of families wiped out entirely, of the living too few to bury the dead, of mass graves that could not be dug fast enough to accommodate the dying. The cause was unknown. God's punishment for sin was the dominant explanation. And how could it be otherwise when the deaths were so numerous, so horrible, so beyond any natural understanding? The flagellants appeared, groups of penitents who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves bloody, believing that their suffering might appease the divine wrath that was killing Christendom. The Jews were blamed, accused of poisoning wells, murdered in pogroms across Europe, even as they died of the same plague that killed their accusers. The fear was contagious as the disease, spreading suspicion and violence alongside the mortality. For the peasants who survived, the plague brought strange liberation. Labor, which had been abundant when population was high, became suddenly scarce when so many workers had died. The lords needed peasants to work their lands, and with fewer peasants available, the peasants could demand better terms. Wages rose, doubled, tripled, because lords who refused to pay could find no workers at all. The bondage of serfdom, which had seemed eternal, began to weaken when peasants could threaten to leave for lords who offered freedom. The rulers tried to stop this. The Statute of Laborers in England, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to bind workers to their employers, to restore the social order that plague had disrupted. Similar statutes were passed across Europe, all attempting to preserve the power of landlords over workers, all ultimately failing because the economic reality was stronger than the legal fiction. You cannot compel labor when the laborers are too few and the alternatives too available. The peasants who survived the plague found themselves, for perhaps the first time in centuries, with bargaining power. The psychological effects were equally profound. To survive when so many had died, what did it mean? The faith that had promised God's protection seemed compromised when churches were filled with corpses, when priests died as readily as sinners, when the sacraments could not save even the faithful. Some turned to intensified devotion, seeking meaning in suffering, finding in the plague confirmation of the Church's teaching that earthly life was mere preparation for eternity. Others turned away from faith, or toward new forms of faith, the mysticism that promised direct experience of God, the lay piety movements that sought religious meaning outside clerical control. The economy transformed. Land that had been scarce became abundant when so many died. Marginal fields that had been cultivated when population pressed were abandoned, returned to forest or pasture. Wool production expanded as lords converted farmland to sheep runs. finding that wool required fewer workers than grain. The patterns of agriculture that had sustained medieval society began to shift, and the peasant economy shifted with them. But the plague did not bring equality, did not destroy the social order, only wounded it. The lords retained their legal powers, even as their economic leverage diminished. The church retained its spiritual authority, even as its moral authority was questioned. The plague killed peasants and lords alike, but the structure that separated them survived, battered but recognizable. The peasant who emerged from the plague years was better positioned than before, but was still a peasant, still subject to rents and tithes, still bound by customs that limited freedom, still at the bottom of a hierarchy that had not collapsed. The mass graves that have been excavated, the bodies stacked without ceremony, without the individual burials that Christianity demanded, speak of a world that had lost the capacity to maintain its own rituals. The priest who should have said the prayers was dead. The family that should have mourned was dead. The grave-diggers who should have dug were dead. The plague overwhelmed not just the body, but the social order, not just the population, but the institutions that gave life meaning. And yet, recovery came. The survivors married and had children. The villages repopulated, though some never recovered and remain abandoned still. The fields were worked again. The rents were paid again. The church bells rang again over populations that slowly climbed toward pre-plague levels. The medieval world continued, changed, but continuous, wounded but alive. The plague's dark passage, the silence that fell over villages, the transformation that followed. Forever written into the history of Europe, forever shaping what came after. The dead who made the living's lives possible in new ways. The catastrophe that was also liberation, that was also horror, that was also the strange alchemy of death and survival that medieval peasants knew more intimately than we can imagine. The rising began in Essex in the spring of 1381, began with resistance to a tax collector, began with the accumulated grievances of decades finding sudden expression in violence. The poll tax, a flat tax that demanded the same payment from rich and poor alike, had been levied 3 times in 4 years to fund a war in France that seemed to bring nothing but defeats. The peasants who had survived the plague and tasted the bargaining power that scarcity provided, who had seen the statute of laborers attempt to deny them the wages the market would bear, who had endured the endless extraction of rents and tithes and fees, these peasants had had enough. The rising spread with remarkable speed. From Essex to Kent, from village to village, the rebels gathered. They burned the manor houses where the records of their bondage were kept, the rolls that documented who owed what to whom, the written evidence of servitude that would prove nothing if reduced to ash. They opened the prisons where those who had resisted had been confined. They killed the lawyers and tax collectors who had made oppression function, who had been the visible instruments of a system that ground the poor between the millstones of lord and church and crown. The leaders who emerged from this rising were remarkable. Wat Tyler, whose origins remain mysterious, perhaps a veteran of the French wars, perhaps a craftsman, certainly a man capable of organizing and commanding the anger of thousands. John Ball, the radical priest who had been imprisoned for preaching sedition, who asked the question that echoed across the centuries. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The question struck at the foundation of medieval hierarchy, suggested that inequality was not ordained by God but invented by men, suggested that the natural state of humanity was equality, that lordship was usurpation. The rebels marched on London. Tens of thousands of them, armed with whatever weapons they could find, converged on the capital. The young King Richard II, 14 years old, met them at Mile End and Smithfield, heard their demands: abolition of serfdom, freedom to buy and sell without restriction, reduction of rents, punishment for the corrupt advisers who had burdened the realm. The king agreed, or appeared to agree, granting charters of freedom that seemed to concede everything the rebels demanded. But the agreement was betrayal. At Smithfield, during negotiations, Wat Tyler was struck down by the Lord Mayor of London, by others who seized the moment when Tyler apparently reached for his dagger. The king rode forward to the rebels, claimed them as his own people, led them away from the confrontation that might have destroyed him. The rebels dispersed, trusting the charters they had been given, believing the promises the king had made. The promises were lies. Once the rebels had dispersed, once the threat to London had dissipated, the charters were revoked. The king who had promised freedom declared that villains they had been, and villains they would remain. The brutal suppression followed: executions of rebel leaders, punishment of villages that had risen, restoration of the order that had momentarily trembled. John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered at St. Albans. The revolt that had seemed for a moment to threaten everything returned to nothing. And yet, the revolt had shown what the many could do when they acted together, had demonstrated that the peasants were not merely passive victims, that they could organize and march and demand, that they could terrify the powerful, however briefly. The memory of the rising would persist, would surface in later protests, would become part of the tradition of English popular resistance that stretched from 1381 to the present. The social changes the rebels had demanded came eventually, not through revolt, but through the slow working of economic forces that neither lords nor peasants fully controlled. Serfdom faded in the centuries following, worn away by plague and labor scarcity and the gradual replacement of labor service with money rents. The freedom that the rebels demanded at Mile End, freedom to buy and sell, to move, to marry without permission, became the norm for English peasants by the 16th century. The victory was delayed, was incomplete, came without the dramatic transformation the rebels had sought, but came nonetheless, in the long working out of changes the revolt had articulated. The echo of the revolt, the memory that lingered, the question that could not be silenced. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The question that challenged every hierarchy, that suggested equality, was original, and inequality was corruption, that planted a seed that would flower in later revolutions, in later demands for rights and dignity and freedom. The revolt that faded, the promises that were broken, the executions that followed, the social order that survived but was changed. Changed because those at the bottom had spoken, had acted, had forced those at the top to see them, however briefly, as threat rather than resource. The peasant who had seemed only a source of labor was revealed as a person capable of demanding personhood. The echo, fading but never entirely silent, forever part of the history of those who had no history. Forever the moment when the voiceless spoke and the powerless acted, and the world, however briefly, seemed about to change. The sound of the millstones turning was the sound of monopoly, the sound of power made material. The Lord's mill stood by the stream, its great wheel turning with the water's flow, its stones grinding the grain that peasants were required to bring there. Required by custom, required by law, required because the Lord who owned the mill owned the right to grind all grain within the manor's bounds. The peasant could not grind his own grain with his own hand mill, could not take his harvest elsewhere, could not escape the fee that the miller charged for the service that the peasant was compelled to use. The fee was typically a multure, a portion of the flour that resulted from grinding. The portion varied, but was significant. 1/16, 1/20, sometimes more, taken from every bushel that passed through the stones. The peasant who brought 10 bushels to be ground took home less than 10 bushels of flour, and the difference fed the miller, fed the Lord, fed a system that extracted value at every point where extraction was possible. The miller himself was figure of suspicion in medieval culture. Chaucer's miller in the Canterbury Tales is crude and dishonest, a man who cheated on the multure, who used his thumb to press the scale, who took more than his due from those who had no alternative. Whether actual millers were as dishonest as their reputation is impossible to know. The suspicion may have been deserved, or may have been the resentment of those forced to deal with a monopoly they could not escape. But the suspicion was real, was widespread, was part of the peasant's experience of the mill as place of extraction rather than service. The technology was impressive. The millstones themselves were carefully chosen and shaped, their surfaces carved with grooves that helped move the grain between them, that prevented the flour from becoming too fine or too coarse. The mechanism that transmitted the water wheel's power to the stones required engineering knowledge that was specialized, that the Lord controlled by controlling the mill, that kept the peasants dependent on a technology they could not replicate. The mill was capital investment that only the wealthy could afford, was infrastructure that created and maintained inequality, was power made physical and hydraulic. The hand mill, the quern, was the peasant's forbidden alternative, a simple device, 2 flat stones that the user rotated against each other, grinding small quantities of grain through muscle power alone. The quern existed in peasant households before the lords built their mills, had served the community's needs when milling was domestic rather than commercial. The lords banned the quern precisely because it threatened their monopoly, because it allowed the peasant to escape the fee, because it represented independence that feudalism could not tolerate. The seizure of querns was recorded in manorial courts. Peasants fined for possessing forbidden mills, their stones confiscated, and sometimes incorporated into the paths leading to the Lord's mill, ground into the road as if to demonstrate the crushing of resistance. The symbolism was probably intentional. The tools of independence literally trodden underfoot on the way to compelled dependence. The peasant who walked that path felt the stones beneath their feet, knew what they represented, knew that the freedom to grind one's own grain was among the freedoms that bondage denied. The mill was not the only monopoly. The Lord might also control the oven where bread was baked, the peasant forbidden to bake at home, required to use the Lord's oven, required to pay the fee that such use demanded. The Lord might control the winepress, the brewhouse, the smithy. Each monopoly captured a portion of the peasant's production. ensured that subsistence was never quite achieved, that surplus was always extracted, that the peasant's labor enriched someone else at every point where enrichment was possible. The economic logic was relentless. The mill represented capital that the Lord could not afford to leave idle. The more grain passed through, the more profit resulted. The monopoly ensured that all grain passed through. The system was efficient in its extraction, elegant in its oppression, thorough in its reduction of the peasant to a source of revenue rather than a person with rights to the product of their own labor. Yet the mill was also meeting place, was social center where villagers gathered while waiting for their grain, where news was exchanged, where the community found another node of connection. The miller knew everyone, knew their affairs, knew their harvests good and bad. The mill was public space of a sort, was part of village life, whatever resentment it also generated. The ambivalence was typical of medieval institutions. The same structure that extracted also connected. The same system that oppressed also organized. The same power that constrained also provided. The woman walking home from the mill, the reduced flour on her back. The portion taken by the miller joining the portion taken by the Lord. The portion taken by the church. What was left was what she had to work with, was what would become the bread that would sustain her family, was the remnant of labor after extraction. She walked past the mill wheel still turning, past the water still flowing, past the mechanism that never stopped grinding, that would grind tomorrow's grain as it had ground today's, that would continue grinding as long as the Lord owned the mill and the peasant needed bread. The mill that ground more than grain, that ground the peasant between the stones of necessity and monopoly, that extracted not just flour, but autonomy, not just fee, but freedom, forever turning, forever grinding, forever the mechanism of power made visible in wheel and stone and water. And then there was joy, fleeting, bounded, permitted rather than chosen, but joy nonetheless. The medieval calendar was not only labor and obligation, it included the festivals that punctuated the year with celebration, that offered relief from the grinding routine, that reminded even the poorest peasant that life contained something other than survival. The festivals were the fleeting light in the darkness, the moments when the weight lifted briefly, the occasions for meat and ale, and dancing and forgetting. Christmas was the great feast of winter, 12 days when work was suspended, when the Lord might distribute alms, when the Church celebrated the Incarnation with masses and processions, when even the poorest households attempted some special observance. The Yule log burned through the darkest nights. The carols were sung, not the gentle hymns we know, but rowdier songs, sometimes bawdy, celebrating the season with earthiness the Church tolerated because the people demanded it. The feast, however modest, marked the holiday. Meat, if possible, special bread, whatever small abundance could be managed, eaten in the darkness while the cold waited outside. The Lord of Misrule presided over Christmas celebrations in some communities, a figure chosen to invert the social order, to command masters and mock the powerful, to embody for a few days the world turned upside down. The inversion was temporary, was permitted precisely because it was bounded, was release valve for tensions that might otherwise explode. The Lord watched his servant give orders. The servant knew that after 12th night he would be servant again. The ritual confirmed the order by briefly suspending it, made hierarchy bearable by acknowledging its absurdity. Easter followed Lent's long deprivation with Resurrection's feast. The 40 days of fasting had deepened the hunger that was already constant, had required abstention from meat and eggs and dairy at precisely the season when such abstention was most difficult. The breaking of the fast on Easter morning was joy doubled, spiritual and physical, the resurrection of Christ paralleled by the resurrection of appetite satisfied. The eggs that had accumulated during Lent were eaten, were given as gifts, were colored and decorated in traditions that reached back beyond Christianity to older celebrations of spring's return. May Day celebrated fertility, the earth awakening, the crops growing, the promise of harvest ahead. Young people went out at dawn to gather flowers, to bring in the May, to dance around the maypole that stood in the village center. The sexuality of the celebration was barely disguised. The May branches phallic, the dancing suggestive, the trips into the woods providing cover for encounters. The church officially condemned but practically ignored. May Day was life asserting itself against the death that winter represented, was joy in the body, that labor usually reduced to instrument, was brief permission to be young and alive when age and exhaustion were the normal conditions of peasant existence. Harvest Home marked the end of the agricultural year's most demanding work. The last sheaf brought in, the fields finally empty, the anxiety of whether there would be enough transformed into the knowledge of what there actually was. The ale flowed at Harvest Home, as it did at few other times, brewed specially for the occasion, strong enough to blur the edges of exhaustion. The food was abundant, relatively abundant, the harvest's first fruits offered in celebration before the long counting began. The songs were traditional, passed down through generations, celebrating the labor just completed, and the rest that was finally, briefly, possible. The church feasts added to the calendar. The Saint's Day of the village's patron, providing occasion for local celebration. Corpus Christi with its processions. Whitsun with its ales. The various feasts that marked the Virgin Mary's life. Each feast was holy day, holiday, when work was prohibited, when the church commanded rest and celebration, when the divine calendar created breaks in the human labor that otherwise seemed without end. The games were part of the festivals, football matches between villages that might involve hundreds of players and few rules, wrestling competitions, archery contests, games of strength and skill that let men demonstrate capabilities the fields did not require. The violence was frequent, bones were broken, feuds were started, deaths occasionally resulted. But the games were also integration, were village solidarity, performed through competition, were young men showing themselves to young women who might choose among them. The music accompanied everything, pipes and tabor, fiddle and drum, the instruments simple, but the rhythms infectious. Dancing continued until legs could no longer move, until the ale had done its work, until the festival's end approached, and the return to routine could no longer be postponed. The dancing was release. Was the body permitted to move for pleasure rather than labor? Was joy expressed through motion that had no productive purpose, that existed only because joy needed expression? And then the festival ended. The decorations came down. The special foods were consumed. The ale was finished. The peasant woke the morning after with the familiar ache and the familiar hunger and the familiar knowledge that the fields were waiting, that the labor would resume, that the fleeting light had fled, and the ordinary darkness had returned. But the festivals had happened, were remembered through the long months between them, were anticipated as the calendar moved toward the next occasion for celebration. The peasant could bear the routine partly because the routine was punctuated, because the festivals provided markers, because there was always something ahead to hope for, even if what lay behind had already faded. The festival's fleeting light, the joy that was permitted, the celebration that was bounded. Forever precious because forever brief, forever remembered because forever needed. The light in the darkness. The break in the routine. The reminder that even peasant life contained moments when the grinding stopped, when the extraction paused, when the body could move for pleasure, and the belly could be filled, and the heart could feel something other than endurance. The churchyard surrounded the church, the consecrated ground where the village dead were buried, where the peasant joined in death, the community that had contained their life. The graves were unmarked, mostly, no stones for those who could not afford them, no monuments for those whose names would be forgotten within a generation. The peasant's grave was a mound that would flatten, a spot that would be reused when enough time had passed, a return to earth that left no permanent trace. Inside the church, the Lord might lie carved in stone, his effigy preserving his features for centuries, his name inscribed for future generations to read. The priest might be buried beneath the floor, his marker worn smooth by the feet of those who came to pray. But the peasant was outside, was in the yard that sloped away from the church walls, was in the common ground where common people went. The rituals of death were important, were perhaps the most important rituals of peasant life. The priest was called when death approached, if there was time, if the death was slow enough to permit the sacraments. The confession was made, the sins acknowledged, the absolution granted that might shorten the time in purgatory's flames. The extreme unction anointed the dying with holy oil, prepared the soul for its journey, marked the transition from living to dead with the church's blessing. The body was washed by family members, was wrapped in a shroud, was watched through the night before burial. The wake was both grief and vigil, both mourning and protection. The soul was thought to be vulnerable between death and burial. The body needed watching, lest evil spirits take possession of what had been abandoned. The candles that burned through the night guided the soul and repelled the darkness. The burial was in the morning. The procession from home to churchyard, the priest leading, the family following, the neighbors joining in the escort that carried the dead to their rest. The prayers were said in Latin. The words the peasant could not understand, but trusted were effective. The ritual that the church promised would help the soul on its way. The body was lowered into the grave without coffin. Coffins were expense that only the wealthy could afford. Was covered with earth that would receive it and decompose it and return it to the soil from which it had been formed. The medieval understanding of death was not our understanding. Death was not ending but transition, not tragedy, but the expected conclusion to a life that was itself merely preparation. The soul would face judgment, would answer for sins committed and virtues practiced, would be consigned to heaven or hell, or most likely, to the purgatory where purification occurred. The living could help the dead through prayers, through masses said on their behalf, through the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead that medieval Christianity maintained. The prayers for the dead were not mere form, were genuine acts of love, were the continuing connection between those separated by death, were the hope that the separation was temporary, that reunion awaited in the eternal life that faith promised. The peasant who knelt in church and prayed for a departed parent or spouse or child was participating in a relationship that death had altered but not ended, was fulfilling an obligation that love created and faith sanctified. But the prayers also cost money. The Mass said for a soul required payment to the priest who said it. The wealthy could endow chantries, chapels where priests prayed perpetually for the founder's soul, could purchase thousands of masses, could reduce their time in purgatory through the investment of wealth they could no longer use. The poor could afford little, faced the prospect of longer purgation because they could not pay for prayers, discovered that inequality persisted even beyond death's supposed equality. The danse macabre, the dance of death, decorated church walls in the later medieval period, depicted death leading pope and emperor and peasant alike in the same dance toward the same end. The imagery was meant to humble the proud, to remind the powerful that their power was temporary, that death was the great leveler. But the peasant who looked at these images might have reflected that even this equality was limited, that the Pope would be buried in St. Peter's, and the peasant would be buried in the muddy churchyard, that even death's democracy was partial. The children who died were buried quickly. So many children died. So many never reached their first birthday. So many were buried before they could receive a name. The grief was real but contained, was perhaps defended against by its very frequency, was expressed in ways that leave little record, because those who grieved were those whose lives left little record. The Church taught that unbaptized infants went to limbo, not hell, but not heaven either, merely an endless existence without the presence of God. The horror of this doctrine for bereaved parents is unimaginable. The doctrinal debates that eventually modified it came too late for the medieval peasants who buried their unbaptized children in unconsecrated ground, outside the churchyard wall, in the shadow land between the living and the properly dead, the grave where all ranks rested equal. But the equality was imperfect. The democracy was partial. The leveling that death promised was undermined by the hierarchies that persisted even in burial. The Lord inside the church, the peasant outside, the wealthy with monuments, the poor with nothing. The prayers purchased by those who could afford them, the souls abandoned by those who could not. And yet, the peasant who stood by a family grave, who remembered the dead, who maintained the connection that death could not entirely sever, this peasant knew something about death that modern distance has lost, knew that the dead were close, were present in memory, were part of the community that included both the living and the departed, knew that death was natural, was expected, was the end that everyone faced, and that therefore could be faced together. The grave, the silence, the return to earth, the hope of resurrection, the fear of purgatory, the love that persisted across the threshold. Forever the ending that was also beginning. Forever the democracy that was also hierarchy. Forever the place where the peasant joined those who had gone before, waiting in the quiet ground for the trump that would raise them, waiting for the judgment that would determine their fate, waiting in the company of all who had ever lived and died and hoped that death was not the final word, the grave where all ranks rested equal, or almost equal, or hoped to be equal when the final accounts were settled. The ending of the medieval peasant's story. Forever approached, forever feared, forever the door through which everyone passed into whatever lay beyond, the grave, the silence, the waiting earth. Closing. The night deepens around us now, and the medieval world begins to fade, not disappearing but receding, becoming once again the past that cannot be directly touched, only imagined through the fragments it left behind. The fields are still visible from the air, their ridge and furrow patterns marking land that has not been plowed since peasants last walked behind their oxen. The churches still stand in villages that remember nothing else of their medieval existence. The words that peasants spoke are lost, but the shapes of their world remain, waiting for those who can see them. What have we learned from this journey? Perhaps only what we already knew but had forgotten. That life is hard, that labor is endless, that the powerful take from the powerless, that survival is achievement, that joy finds its way even through the smallest openings. The medieval peasant was not so different from us. Not really. Wanted what we want, food enough, warmth enough, love enough, meaning enough. Found these things or did not find them, as we find them, or fail to find them. Lived and died within limits that seem crushing to us, but that were simply the limits of existence to those who knew no other. The sleep that approaches now carries us backward from this ancient world, returns us to our own time with its own limits and its own possibilities. The darkness that falls is the darkness that fell over medieval villages when the fires burned low, but we have lights to push it back, have warmth that does not depend on cutting wood, have food that does not depend on the harvest we ourselves plant and tend, and pray will succeed. We are fortunate. The medieval peasant would not have believed how fortunate, would not have imagined electricity or medicine or education or the abundance that we take for granted, would have thought us blessed beyond measure, would have wondered what sins we must commit that we do not use these blessings better, would have marveled that we who have so much are not happier than they who had so little. Sleep now. Let the medieval world settle into the place where history rests, remembered, honored, distant, but never entirely gone. The peasants who worked those fields are dust now, their names forgotten, their graves unmarked. But they lived, they struggled, they endured, and something of what they built persists in the contours of the land, in the stones of village churches, in the traditions that we carry without knowing where they came from. Sleep now, and if you dream, perhaps you will dream of a field at dawn, mist rising from the furrows, a figure walking into the light with a plow they do not own, toward a harvest they hope will be enough. The medieval peasant, forever working, forever hoping, forever one of us, however distant. The story ends, but the fields remain, the churches remain, the memory, however faint, remains. Good night. Rest well, and wake remembering that you too are part of a long story, that your life continues what others began, that the labor of the past made the present possible, and that what you do with your portion of existence matters to those who come after, matters to the story that will continue when you, like the medieval peasant, have become history. The end. and always, always the beginning, the sish.